The then method is used to respond to monitor promises. In the previous topic, I used a function that I set up to return a promise. Let's now take a look at the fetch API. This is a commonly used interface for retrieving resources or data over a network. With fetch, we provide a URL to a location where we want to retrieve data, and it returns a promise. We then need to work with that promise to get the data. In the early days of JavaScript, this was generally accomplished with an XML HTTP request. But fetch is much easier to use and is generally what you will see today. So for this example, we're going to be using the JSON placeholder sample site for another application of promises using fetch. Now here is the JSON placeholder site. This site provides a place for testing and prototyping. We'll be making requests to the site for specific data. Now, if we scroll down on this site, you'll see something that looks familiar from our last topic. Right here, you can see then methods being used. And so this is familiar to what we've done with promises in the past. Now remember, fetch returns a promise. And so here's an example of how it is handling that promise. Also, we scroll down a little bit more here, we can take a look at sample data that is provided. Whenever you're retrieving data from a site you're not familiar with, it is important to know how the data is provided so that you can work with it. Now, we're going to be working with posts in this example. So if I click on this, it shows me some sample data. And notice that the data will be returned in an array. It's an array of objects, and then there are individual objects with data in it. We have a user ID property, which we are going to be using as a part of this exercise we're looking at. And there are just numerous, a total of about 100, I think, is what the sample data is. Now, this is JSON data. This is a JSON data that is returned from this site. So an array of objects in JSON format. All right. So now we know what we're working with. Let's go ahead and set up an example. So here in Visual Code, I'm going to start setting things up. I'm going to use the fetch command. Now when we use the fetch command, the thing that we pass in is a URL. And I'm going to place that in a string. Now the URL I need to use, I can get from the JSON placeholder site. And JSON placeholder.typicode.com. And I want to extract the post. And so this is the URL I use to extract a post. If we go back here to the JSON placeholder site, and we scroll up to this example here, we can see that this one's extracting to-dos, and it's extracting a specific to-do. Therefore, the number is after it. I want to extract all of the posts, and so I'm not using a specific number there. All right. Now remember, this returns a promise. So we now need to deal with that. So I'm going to indent so I know this is all connected, and then I use a then method. Now we have to enter a function inside the then method that will handle the promise that is returned. Now the value of the promise that is returned from a fetch method is a response object. That's what we receive as a value. So once that is fulfilled, once that promise is fulfilled, we're going to have a response object. So I'm going to use response as my variable to store that. And then what am I going to do with this? Well, the response object doesn't have the data in a format that we can work with. It contains the data, but we need to pull that data out of the response object. Now, a response object has two methods. One is a JSON method and one is a text method. And those two methods retrieve the data that we want. Now, I want to use JSON. I want to retrieve that as JSON. And so I'm going to enter response.json JSON. I'm going to use that method of the response object. The object is stored in this variable, so we refer to that variable .json. And this method here, JSON method, will return a promise. So now you're getting an idea why, when we were looking at that example, we have two then methods. We're chaining them together because the JSON method that we're going to use as a part of the response object is going to return another promise. And so we want to handle that using a then method. And because we're using the JSON method, it's going to return JSON text. And then I want to do something with it. Right now, let's just log it to the console so we can see whether we got the right data or not. All right, so I'll go ahead and save that. And let me just go out here and take a look at the console. And we have an array of 100. And that's how many posts there are. And see how the data is shown here. Each of these are objects within this array. User ID, ID, title, and then body. There's also a body for the post. So that's working for us. We had to chain then methods to get that to happen, to get that to work. Now, what if we wanted to process this data more? So how would we go about handling that? Well, what I'm going to do is I'm going to copy in a function here, so you don't have to watch me enter it. So I'm going to use this function to process the data. And basically what this function takes is an array and then a user ID. And what it's going to return is an array. Notice we're using the filter method that we learned in the previous section. We're going to filter through that and only get posts that have a specific user ID. That's what we're going to do. So it'll return an array that has all the posts of a particular user. That's how we're going to process that data. So now that we have that function set up, then we can go ahead and process. And it's down here in this function that we would want to do that. So let's go ahead and modify this function. Since we're going to need more than one line of code, I'm going to put in curly braces here. And that's going to allow us to do more than a single line of code. And the first line, I'm going to declare a variable here. I'm going to just call it user1post because the user we're going to filter out has an ID of 1. And then I'm going to set that equal to filter posts by user. And what I'm going to pass in there, well, I'm going to pass in the JSON variable, because this contains what was returned. And remember, as we looked at the data, it is in an array. So I'm going to pass that in. And then I'm going to also pass in the user ID that I want to filter. And that happens to be a 1. So that's going to return an array into user1post. And then for now, I'll just log that to the console so we can see whether that's correct or not. So if I go ahead and save that, come out here, now our array only has 10. And if we look at that, if we open it up, we can see that user ID is 1 for all of that. So we're able to process that. Now, what about errors? Notice with these then methods, I only entered one function. I did not enter a second function in either of these. And so if there was an error, if something was rejected for some reason, we wouldn't be able to handle it because I don't have a function for those to handle it. Well, when we're chaining multiple then methods like we have here, and this is something you run into frequently where you have more than one then method that you're chaining together. And when you're doing this, there is a shortcut way for handling errors. Basically, what we can do is we can chain one more method, a catch method. Promises also support a catch method. And basically what the catch method does is it handles any rejections, any errors that occur in the previous then methods. So it will take care of all of them. We only have to enter it once. We don't have to enter a function for every single then method. So it's much easier to deal with. So just like with then, we have to enter a function here. And I'm just going to set up a function that basically will log an error to the console. And we'll just say error, and then I'm going to concatenate whatever message is. So this variable will grab the message if there is a rejection, if there is a problem, and it will go ahead and concatenate that and log it to the console. So I'm going to force an error so that we can see what happens. Go ahead and save that. Come out here, and as you can see, we get our error. We have an error showing up for us. I changed the URL so we get a get error, but also the promise or the catch method displays an error as well. So there we've had it. We've added a couple things promises here. We used the fetch API, and then we talked about using the catch method. Whenever we're chaining then methods together, or even if we just have one, we can use that catch method to handle any problems that occur. And that is a really efficient way to deal with that. All right, let's move on to the next topic.